She stood outside the house she once called home, her hands trembling as she stared at the front door, the same door she had walked through as a child without fear, the same door she had once believed would always protect her. And yet now it felt like the entrance to something she had spent years trying to escape. And the question that stayed with her, the one she could never fully answer, was how everything changed so completely without anyone noticing. How a life that once felt full of love and safety slowly turned into something she could barely recognize. Because Emily Carter did not grow up in chaos. She grew up in a home that felt steady, warm, and predictable in the best way. A home shaped by the presence of her mother, Laura Carter, who carried the kind of love that made everything else feel manageable. You're the kind of woman who noticed when Emily was quiet for too long, who remembered the smallest details, who made even ordinary days feel meaningful. And alongside her was Daniel Carter, a father who provided structure and stability, a man who believed that as long as he showed up every day and did what was expected of him, his family would always remain secure. And for a long time that belief held true, because inside that house there was laughter, there were routines, there was a sense of safety that felt unshakable. And Emily grew up believing that nothing could take that away, that no matter what happened outside those walls, inside them everything would remain the same. But life does not always give warnings before it changes direction, and the shift began in a way that felt almost too small to notice. A few quiet mornings where Laura seemed more tired than usual, a few moments where she paused mid-sentence as if searching for something she could not quite find. And at first, no one treated it as anything serious, because in a life that feels stable, it is easy to believe that small disruptions will pass, but they didn't. And over time, those small moments became something heavier, something that slowly settled into the atmosphere of the home, something Emily could feel even if she did not fully understand it. And as the days turned into weeks, the reality became impossible to ignore. Laura Carter was not just tired, she was unwell. And the woman who had once been the center of everything began to fade in ways that left Emily confused and afraid. Because when you are young, you expect the people who take care of you to always remain strong. So you expect them to always be there. And when that expectation begins to break, it creates a kind of fear that stays with you long after the moment has passed. And for Emily, that fear became real on the day everything changed, the day her mother was no longer there. The day the house that once felt full suddenly felt empty. And in that silence, something else began to take shape. Something no one in that home was prepared for. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We always love seeing how far these stories reach. And if you haven't already, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Because what happened next was not immediate. It was not obvious. It was something that unfolded slowly in ways that were easy to overlook at first. And that is what makes this story difficult to understand. Because if everything had changed overnight, someone might have stepped in, someone might have noticed. But that is not how it happened. It began with small shifts, subtle changes that felt almost reasonable in the context of grief. And by the time those changes became something else entirely, it was already too late to go back. In the weeks after Laura Carter's passing, the house felt unfamiliar in ways that were difficult to explain. Not because anything had physically changed, but because everything felt different without her presence. The air felt quieter, the routines felt incomplete, and even the smallest moments carried a sense of absence that could not be ignored. And for Emily Carter, that absence was not something she could escape. It followed her from room to room, and it stayed with her in the mornings and lingered at night. And while she tried to hold on to the version of her life that still existed in her memory, her father, Daniel Carter, seemed to be moving in a different direction. Not intentionally, not in a way that suggested he was leaving her behind, but in a way that made it clear that he was searching for something to fill the space that had been left behind, something to make sense of a reality that no longer felt stable. And it was in that search that Rebecca Hayes entered their lives. Not suddenly, not in a way that disrupted everything at once, but gradually, almost quietly, as if she had always been meant to be there. She was introduced as someone who understood loss, someone who knew how to navigate difficult situations, someone who could bring a sense of calm back into a home that had lost its center. And at first, that is exactly how she appeared. Calm, composed, attentive, the kind of presence that made Daniel feel as though he was making the right decision, the kind of presence that others would look at and believe was exactly what the family needed. And for a short time, Emily tried to believe that as well. But even in those early days, there were moments that stayed with her, moments that felt out of place in ways she could not fully explain. Small changes in tone, subtle shifts in behavior, comments that seemed harmless on the surface, but carried something underneath, something that made her pause, something that made her question whether she was imagining things or noticing something real. And at first she told herself it was nothing, so that it was just part of adjusting to a new dynamic, that things were supposed to feel different after everything they had been through. But, as time passed, those moments became more frequent, more noticeable and harder to ignore. And what made it even more complicated was that no one else seemed to see it. No one else reacted to the same things she was noticing, and that created a kind of isolation that was difficult to describe, because it made her question not just what was happening, but her own perception of it. The first real change came in the form of expectations, not rules at first, just suggestions about how things should be done, how the house should be kept, how conversations should be handled, and at first those suggestions seemed reasonable, even helpful. But over time they became more specific, more consistent. And when Emily did not meet those expectations, the response she received was not direct. It was not loud or aggressive. It was something quieter, something more controlled, something that made her question whether she had done something wrong, even when she wasn't sure what that something was. And that uncertainty began to settle into her thoughts, into the way she moved through her day, into the way she interacted with the people around her. And slowly, the home that once felt like a place of comfort became a place where she was constantly aware of herself, constantly adjusting, constantly trying to avoid doing something that might create tension. As the months passed, those expectations turned into rules, and those rules began to shape the environment of the home in ways that were difficult to challenge. Because from the outside nothing appeared unusual, the house still looked the same. The routines were still in place. The image of a stable family remained intact. But inside, the dynamic had changed completely, and Emily was the only one who seemed to feel it, the only one who recognized that something was not right. And when she tried to express that feeling to her father, the response she received was not what she needed. It was not dismissal, but it was not support either. It was something in between, something that left her feeling unheard without directly rejecting what she was saying. And over time, that response taught her something she did not fully understand at the time. It taught her that speaking up would not change anything, and that silence was easier. There was a moment, one that would later stand out as a turning point, see where everything seemed to become clearer, It happened on an evening that felt ordinary at first, but something in Rebecca's tone carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. And when Emily responded carefully, trying to avoid conflict, the reaction she received made it clear that this was no longer about guidance or structure. It was about control. And in that moment, something shifted inside her, not suddenly, not dramatically, but in a way that made everything else begin to fall into place. And from that point forward, she began to see patterns where she had once seen isolated moments. She began to recognize the way situations were managed, the way conversations were redirected, the way her father's perception was influenced, and that awareness marked the beginning of a different kind of struggle. One that was no longer about understanding what was happening, but about deciding what to do with that understanding. And that decision would take time, more time than she expected, because leaving a situation like that is never simple. It is not just about walking away. It is about everything that comes with it. The uncertainty, the fear, the questions about what happens next. And as she began to consider that possibility, she also began to notice things she had not fully seen before. Details that suggested there was more to Rebecca Hayes than what had been presented. Conversations that hinted at intentions beyond what anyone had considered. And those discoveries added another layer to everything she was already dealing with. Because now, it was not just about how she was being treated. It was about why. And that question would lead her to uncover something that would change everything she thought she understood about the situation. Something that would force her to make a decision she could no longer avoid. And what she chose to do next would determine everything that followed. Because once Emily Carter reached that point, there was no returning to the version of her life where things could be explained away or ignored. There was only the reality in front of her, and the understanding that if she stayed, nothing would change. And if anything, it would only become harder to leave. And so she began to move differently. Not in a way that anyone else would notice at first, but in small, deliberate steps, paying closer attention to what was said, what was done, what was left unsaid. It's because she had started to realize that the truth of what was happening in that house was not in the obvious moments. It was in the patterns, the repeated behaviors, the consistency of control that revealed itself over time. And as she observed those patterns, something else became clear. Rebecca Hayes was not reacting to situations. She was shaping them, guiding them in ways that ensured she remained in control. And once Emily saw that, she could not unsee it. It showed up in conversations, in the way decisions were framed before they were even made, in the way her father's responses seemed to align more with Rebecca's perspective than with anything Emily tried to express. And that was when another realization began to form, one that was even more difficult to accept, because it was not just about Rebecca Hayes anymore. It was about Daniel Carter, about the way he had changed, about the way he seemed to accept things without question, about the way he no longer responded with the same awareness he once had. And Emily struggled with that realization more than anything else because it meant acknowledging that the one person she had always relied on was no longer the same, that the person who was supposed to protect her was no longer seeing what she needed him to see. And that kind of understanding does not come easily. It does not settle quietly. It creates a conflict that stays with you, a conflict between what you hope is still true and what you are beginning to understand. There were moments when she tried again, moments when she chose to speak, to explain, to find a way to make her father understand what she was experiencing. But each time the outcome was the same, the conversation would shift. It would lose its urgency. It would become something else entirely, something that no longer carried the weight of what she had tried to say. And those moments did not just leave her feeling unheard. They left her feeling alone in a way that was deeper than anything she had experienced before, because it was not just the absence of support, it was the presence of misunderstanding. And that is a different kind of isolation, one that changes how you see the people around you. As time passed, the environment inside the house became more structured, more controlled, more defined by rules that were no longer subtle. And while those rules were still presented in a way that seemed reasonable on the surface, the effect they had was something else entirely. They limited how Emily moved through her own home, how she spoke, how she existed within that space, and that limitation began to affect everything, not just her actions, but her thoughts, her confidence, her sense of self. And what made it even more difficult was that, from the outside, everything still appeared normal. There were no obvious signs, no clear indicators that anything was wrong. And that contrast between appearance and reality created a situation where Emily felt as though she was living in two different worlds at once, one that others could see and one that only she experienced. But even in that environment, even with that level of control, there were moments where things did not align perfectly, moments where something slipped, something that revealed more than it was meant to. And Emily began to notice those moments. She began to hold on to them, to connect them. And over time, those small pieces began to form a clearer picture. A picture that suggested that Rebecca Hayes's intentions were not simply about maintaining order. They were about maintaining control in a way that extended beyond the surface. And that understanding brought with it a new level of urgency. Because now, Emily was no longer just reacting to what was happening. She was beginning to understand why it was happening. The discovery did not come all at once. It came gradually, through fragments of conversations, through things that were said when they were not meant to be heard, through details that did not seem important on their own, but carried weight when seen together. And what those details suggested was something Emily had not fully considered before, and that Rebecca Hayes's presence in their lives was not just about helping the family move forward, it was about securing a position, about establishing influence, about creating a dynamic where her role could not be questioned. And once that dynamic was in place, everything else became easier to control, including how others perceived what was happening. That realization changed everything, because it meant that what Emily was experiencing was not accidental. It was not the result of misunderstanding or adjustment. It was part of something more deliberate, something that had been developing over time. And once she understood that, the idea of staying became impossible to justify, because staying meant accepting a reality that she now knew was not going to change. And that is what finally pushed her to act. Not suddenly, not without hesitation, but with a clarity that had taken months, maybe even years, to form. The decision to leave was not a single moment. It was a process, one that involved careful planning, small steps, moments of doubt, and moments of certainty. And when the time finally came, when everything aligned in a way that made it possible, Emily Carter made the choice to walk away. Not with the confidence that everything would be better immediately, but with the understanding that it was the only way forward. And that choice, as difficult as it was, marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. What followed was not easy. It was not a simple transition from one life to another. It was a period of rebuilding, of rediscovering who she was outside of the environment she had been in, of learning how to trust her own thoughts again, by how to make decisions without second-guessing herself, how to exist in a space where she did not feel constantly observed or evaluated. And that process took time, it took effort, it took a level of resilience that she had developed without even realizing it, and slowly, piece by piece, She began to create a life that felt like her own again. But even as she moved forward, even as she built something new, the past did not disappear. It remained with her, not as something that controlled her, but as something that informed her understanding of the world, of people, of the way situations can unfold in ways that are not immediately visible. And that perspective became a part of who she was, something that shaped how she saw things, how she responded to situations, how she recognized patterns that others might overlook. Years later, when she found herself standing in front of that house again, it was not the same moment it had once been. It was not filled with the same fear, the same uncertainty. It was something different, something quieter, something more reflective, because now she was no longer the person who had lived inside that experience without understanding it. She was someone who had moved beyond it, someone who could look back and see the full picture, not just the moments, but the connections between them, the way everything had unfolded over time. And in that moment, as she stood there, looking at a place that had once defined so much of her life, Emily Carter understood something that had taken years to fully grasp. That what happened to her was not just about one person or one situation, and it was about how easily things can change when the balance that holds a life together is disrupted, how quickly trust can be misplaced when people are searching for something to hold on to, and how difficult it can be to recognize what is happening when everything appears normal from the outside. And that is what makes this story stay with people, not just because of what happened, but because of what it represents. Because it raises a question that does not have a simple answer, a question about awareness, about responsibility, about the moments when something feels off but is not fully understood, and whether those moments are recognized or ignored. Because sometimes the most important turning points in our lives are not the ones that are obvious. They are the ones that happen quietly, gradually, are in ways that are easy to overlook until they can no longer be ignored. So, as you think about Emily's story, as you reflect on everything you have heard, there is one question that remains, one question that only you can answer. If you had been in her position, would you have recognized the signs? Would you have trusted your instincts? Or would it have taken time, distance, and experience to fully understand what was happening? Because sometimes the hardest truths are not the ones we cannot see, but the ones we struggle to accept. And Emily's story is a reminder of just how important it is to pay attention to those moments, to listen to that quiet voice that tells you something is not right, because it might be the only thing guiding you toward the truth. Everything that followed,